to good friends, the ones we hold dear, the ones who will tell us what we need to hear, the ones who love us right or wrong, and to all those good friends that give you this song.
Well, hello good friends, and welcome back to The Last Walk, Remember When, with your host, Ron Baumbach. And we're going back in time again to the fun times. The year is 1967. So get up off your easy chair, walk over to your stove, make a piping pot of hot tea. There's a big hint there. Go to your cupboard, pull out a Cadbury Crunchy. Sit back in your easy chair, turn on your lava lamp, close your eyes, get ready. The Last Walk is back.
Life is too short, we get only one turn. With luck we find beauty, but we sometimes get burned. But if you've had a true friend, or perhaps love, you've experienced the peace of heaven above.
All summer long we spent dancing in the sand, and the jukebox kept on playing Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band.
Well, thank you, Johnny Rivers, for that great song, Summer Rain, from 1967. Think back. It was first on May 26th, 1967. And June 1st, some say June 2nd, 1967, when a group released a record that was a monumental change in the way we listen to music. Yes, what was the song and what was the album that made that rockin' change in 1967? Yes, it was Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And am I the only one who spells Sergeant, S-A-R-G-E-A-N-T? I have learned over the years it's S-G-T, as everyone else knows. Going back in time, I got some good information from my good buddy Mike, who was my college roommate 50 years ago we met. And Mike was a real aficionado of the Beatles. And I was an aficionado of oldies, the old rock and roll music, and also the Motown sound. So when the Beatles came around, we had a little bit of a discussion in our room about what music to play. Because Mike owned the record player back then. He had one of those, it wasn't even 8-track, it was an actual record player with a turntable. And he had most of the records. Mike controlled what was played in the room. I had my radio, and he got the sounds coming through my little transistor radio. But Mike's sounds was really good. And we heard a lot of the Beatles music. And when the Sgt. Pepper's came out in 67, as we became freshmen, that was a big, big hit. I told Mike the Beatles will be a flash in the pan. They won't make it. In 50 years from now, no, people are going to say, who were they? Well, they all said, I'm wrong. The Beatles made it big, as we all know. And Mike, you were 100% correct. So thank you all for listening to this. We're going back in time, thinking about what happened and how it occurred when the Beatles made the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Can you think back? Can you know the songs that were in that album? Can you list them in order?
Gonna try with a little help from my friend.
We've all had a lot of help from our friends, and I have mine. Thanks, Mike, for helping me out with this show, especially this one. What were your favorite songs from the album? What was the one that when you think back, it brings back a fond memory? We have a granddaughter named Lucy. So, when I hear this song, which I believe was the third song on the album, I think of my lovely, beautiful Lucy. Now, thanks to the folks at youdiscovermusic.com, we find some interesting facts about Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the album. After it was released, it rose to number 1 on the chart for the rest of the year. It knocked out the soundtrack of The Sound of Music. It spent 15 weeks as number 1 in the USA. And in 2003, Rolling Stone magazine listed it as the number 1 album of the 500 greatest albums of all time. Now, what's the interesting part about how they recorded it? You may not know, but the Beatles locked themselves away for a number of weeks to record this album. They used 4-track equipment. I believe it was the first time that was used.
It's getting better all the time. Getting so much better all the time.
Who in your life is a person who knows music the best? There must be someone. I have a nephew in a band for years. He's performed around the world. He knows music really well. But the guy who really knows it the best is my roommate Mike Chessman from back in college. He knew it 50 years ago, and he knows it today. And I asked him to give me some recollections of what the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band meant to him. And Mike gave me some really good information, which I'll share with you now. Now, back then, Mike grew up in Newburgh, New York. And growing up in the 60s, his younger sister filled the house with the music of the day. In 1960s, we heard Bobby Rydell, The Four Seasons, Jan and Dean. They were probably the favorites that played in Mike's household. In 64, the drifting went from those kind of sounds to the British band that caught his ear. The band appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show a few times, and Mike got hooked, along with most of young America. A British invasion followed that included the Rolling Stones, the Animals, Jerry and the Pacemakers, the Dave Clark Five, and one of my favorites, Peter and Gordon, and of course the Searchers, and dozens more. Still, it was the Beatles' music that dominated the record stores. The Beatles own the record stores, and they own the listening ears of all those teenagers around the world. We had a local radio station that every evening back then in Mike's hometown played many songs, and they featured exclusively Beatles songs during the height of what we called Beatlemania. Their early albums were straight-ahead rock and roll, and many of the songs the Beatles did were wildly exciting cover versions of songs by American artists such as Chuck Berry, Buddy Holly, Little Richard, Carl Perkins, and many others. What was different about the Beatles was how many songs were written by their group, in particular Lennon and McCartney.
Hey Jude, don't make it bad. Take a sad song. Yesterday, Michelle, my belle. When I find myself in times of trouble, Mother Mary comes to me.
Now, that were a few of my personal favorites. What are your favorite Beatles songs of all time? But back to Sgt. Pepper's. In December of '65, the music the Beatles had evolved dramatically, incorporating different instruments and styles. They produced the standout album of the year. Do you recall the name of that album? It composed all original songs. It was called Rubber Soul. As a teenager growing up, my buddy Mike loved the Beatles, and his music evolved with them. American artists launched their own musical evolution, such as the Byrds, Simon and Garfunkel, and Bob Dylan. It was creative and inspirational, a big battle to see who would hit the next milestone in our music. In the spring of 1966, the Beach Boys, who hung out with the Beatles, did it with their Pet Sounds album. And in reply, the Beatles in late summer of '66 unleashed another evolutionary record album called Revolver. This one was a bit more experimental, with unusual recording techniques, backwards guitar riffs, multi-layered vocals. And then, in June of 1967, the Beatles once again set the bar to a much higher level. The release of the one and only Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. At the time, the sound was simply amazing. Layers of sound carefully mapped out in the recording studio by the Beatles and their producer and mentor, George Martin. Now, Sgt. Pepper was music you generally listened to as a whole. Each song flowed into the next. There was no hit single for radio play. Each song was a different listening experience, but was programmed interestingly enough to produce a true listening experience. It was really smooth. A big factor in the album's uniqueness was the use of their 4-track recording, which enabled the Beatles to add a new track mixed over the previous track to make an ever more complex musical palette. Listening today, the album seems much more simplistic than what we recall back then. But of course, today, musicians have unlimited tracks to record on, and anyone with a computer could generate an album similar in scope to what Sgt. Pepper did back then, assuming, of course, they had the same musical talent, which we really doubt. And most of us who grew up in the 60s would be in the 60s by then. But my good friend Mike goes on to tell me that in '67, he'd head up to his upstairs bedroom, turn up the volume on his rather primitive portable record player. It was pretty good to me from what I recall back in college. He would sit there and look the album cover over with his printed lyrics, a new idea at the time. Other times he would lay back on his bed and listen in total darkness to focus completely on the wonderful music of Sgt. Pepper's. Now, Mike still enjoys listening to Sgt. Pepper's today. And with today's technology, he gets to hear it in surround sound and in far better fidelity than when it was first released 50 years ago. And in Mike's mind, this wasn't the best album the Beatles ever released, but it's part of a body of work that pushed the boundaries of rock music throughout the 60s. It was a tipping point. The impact of this album and the Beatles' creativity still is held in high respect by tons and tons of today's artists. From their final live performance in the 70s Let It Be album, John Lennon announced, "I'd like to say thank you on behalf of the group and ourselves, and I hope we pass the audition. Guys, I think you made it." And then some, my buddy Mike says. Sgt. Pepper 50 years ago. Man, it's hard to believe. Even his grandkids and my grandkids go around singing Beatles songs like Yellow Submarine, All Together Now, or some of the cover songs like Bad Boy, Please Mr. Postman, or Twist and Shout.
There are places I remember all my life, though some have changed, some forever, not for better. Some have gone, and some remain.
You've been listening to The Last Walk, Remember When, with your host, Ron Baumbach. We've been doing a tribute to the great album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which made a big difference in June of 1967, and it's still making a difference to this day. And a tribute to the people who put it together, the Beatles, George, Paul, Ringo, and John, 4 guys who really made a difference. And Paul and Ringo, we're glad you still do. Thanks so much, guys, for everything you've done for music and making everyone stay with you and listen to you over the years. And of course, a special thanks to my great friend Mike Chessman, my college roommate, for his recollection of the song and the music of the era, and all the information he's given me to help me with this show and all the others. I really appreciate it, Mike. And of course, I need to thank Paul Cassone for the wonderful